When we left Europe last time, it's been about 10 classes ago, Europe was being invaded, Europe was being hounded. The Huns came in from the Far East. And in addition, there were the Germans coming down from the north. And it was too much for the Roman Empire to handle. Well, Rome collapsed. Now, not all of Rome collapsed. The Eastern Byzantine Empire was destined to last 1,000 years. We'll talk more about that later. The Huns were from Central Asia. They were led by Attila the Hun. Attila believed he was on a mission from God. He finally was defeated. What actually happened he did not count on was the Germans and Romans got together in one big army and they surrounded him and would have annihilated him, but the Roman general decided, hey, I might can get Attila on my side to fight the Germans. So this general opened up a hole where Attila's army could run through. So Attila the Hun escaped. And after that, he was somewhat afraid and timid of the Romans because they defeated him once. Eventually, Attila the Hun died from nosebleed. He died in his sleep. The nosebleed choked off his breathing. The Huns eventually settled down and formed the nation of Hungary. And I worked with a Hungarian man one time, and he looked a little bit Oriental. The Huns settled in the nation of Hungary. The Vandals, they were a German people. We get the word vandalism from them. They would plunder and destroy much of the Roman Empire. They would simply move from one place to another, destroying crops, eating crops, stealing cattle, stealing horses, stealing everything in their path. And basically they were very destructive. Folk, it's been more than, 50 years I wrote the paper on the fall of the Roman Empire, but one thing I did not mention, that if I had to do it over again, I'd mention the Romans let these less than civilized people in, and they wound up destroying their empire. This is history, folks, standard history. They let these people in. Ideally, they should have said, no, until you learn our ways, you can't come in, we can't let you in and destroy our buildings, destroy our crops. We simply cannot allow that. All right, now, for those of you of English descent, like I am, well, my wife and I recently had our DNA tested, and we used our son because that way we get both of us. And he said, why me? I said, because you're the only male child I have. He understood the Y chromosome DNA would have passed through me to him. And it shows that between my wife and I, we're of French, German, and British and Scottish descent. The name Cunningham is purely Scottish, even though a lot of Cunninghams went to Ireland. But anyway, also, because some of her folks came from Spain and Portugal. Leaving it, the Angles. That's where we get to name Angleland or England. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Saxons, Jutes. All right, folk. These three people, different peoples, came into England. The people who had been living there in Roman time were the Britons. That's where we get to name Britain. The Britons were driven out of England, and a lot of them settled in what is today Wales, and so that's where the Welsh comes from. The Welsh are primarily Briton descent, or some of them crossed English Channel and moved into what is today called Brittany. Brittany is a part of northern France. It's a peninsula. So the Britons, but now, if you look into detail about the story of the Britons, there's some things in the records that simply do not, well, there's missing gaps in the records. But the story that's considered the greatest story of all Western literature comes from these people, the Britons. It's the story about King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table, his wife Guinevere, and his most powerful knight, Sir Lancelot. and Sir Lancelot's son, Sir Galahad. And then there's Sir Gawain and Sir Ector, Sir Kay, and a whole lot of other knights in the Round Table. And of course there's the sorcerer Merlin. These stories were considered serious history by the persons who told them. If Arthur existed at all, he would have lived around the year 500 CE. The last time I did research on him, the author said it's obvious that Arthur did not exist because we don't have any original sources. At times, we think we found his castle at Camelot. There's a place in Scotland. But what we do know from the records is for 40 years, no Germans came in and invaded Britain. These 40 years would coincide with Arthur's reign. According to the records, Arthur encountered these Germans as they were invading, but using a magical sword, he was able to lead his armies to victory over the Germans and stop the Germans from invading. How many of you are familiar with the story of Arthur? Okay, a couple of you. All right. I'll go ahead and tell you how it got started, where the story starts. It starts with his father, Uther Pendragon, and it starts with Uther's #1 advisor, the sorcerer Merlin. According to the story, Merlin's origin, Merlin was the son of a fallen angel and an earth woman. And as far as I know, folks, this is the last time in history that this is said to have happened. And when the devil heard that there had been an angel invade Earth one more time, and he thought, I have my man, Merlin will be mine. But instead, Merlin's mother began attending church every time the doors were open. And Merlin, instead of becoming a Satan's man, became a Christian sorcerer. And Satan had lost his Antichrist. But anyway, leaving that, Uther the king had an illegitimate son. And Merlin said to Uther, you'll never get to raise up your boy. Shortly after the son was born, Merlin died. I mean, not Merlin, Uther died. Uther died. Merlin took the young baby, the son of the king Uther, and took him to Sir Ector and said, Sir Ector, you don't know who this boy is, but keep him, and when I need him, I'll send for him, I'll call for him. He'll come forth at due time. Then Merlin wedged a sword in a stone, and he told the people of England, the person who can pull this sword out of the stone is the rightful king of England. Well, 15 years went by. Every knight in the realm tried to pull the sword out of the stone, and nobody could. Well, 15 years went by, and there was be a party. Young Arthur, young lad of 15 years old, eagerly looked forward to the party. I mean, in those days, they didn't have movies or theaters to go to, didn't have water parks, didn't have amusement parks. So parties were a big thing for him. Well, his older brother, Sir Kay, had just been made a knight. And Sir Kay, in the excitement of having just been made a knight, went to the party and forgot his sword. That was a disgrace. So Sir Ector said to young Arthur, you go home and fetch your brother's sword. And Arthur was extremely upset. Just my luck that my older brother would have to forget his sword. Then Arthur remembered, hey, right nearby, just a short hop away, was the churchyard. And in the churchyard, there was a sword wedged in a stone. And Arthur said, hey, if I could just get this sword, I won't miss any of the party. And besides, he had heard that anything that was in a churchyard belonged to everybody in the community. As long as he put it back when he was through with it, nobody would miss it. Nobody ever used it. So he went to the churchyard. The accounts say he pulled the sword out with one hand. And you may not realize, the safest way to carry a sword out of the sheath is to hold it high in the air. So he held his sword high in the air and ran pell-mell back to the party, broke into the clearing where the party was with a sword high in the air. He did not notice that everybody who saw him started grabbing each other's attention. Look at that, look at that. He did not notice that everybody started following him. In fact, he didn't notice anything was out of the ordinary. He got where his father was watching. Son, where did you get this? Oh, Dad, I promise. I'll put it back. Nobody will miss it. I'll put it back when I threw it. Son, did you pull the sword out of the stone in the churchyard? Well, at this point, Arthur became aware that the whole crowd, highborn and lowborn, had stopped the party. Everything had stopped. All activity had ceased. The whole crowd was gathering around him. He still did not know what he had done. Well, he began to, actually the crowd, the higher ups in the crowd got their heads together and decided they should go back to the church and wedge the stone back in place, which they did. The strongest men in the realm tried and tried to pull the sword out. None of them could. Well, of course, they gave Arthur his turn. Arthur reached over like he done with one hand and pulled it out for the whole crowd. One of the older men in the group said, you know, I knew Uther Pendragon when Uther was that boy's age, and I always thought that that boy resembled Uther. Finally, Sir Ector pulled Arthur aside and said, now listen, Arthur, I got something to tell you. I was told to tell you that I was your father, but I really am not your father. And Arthur said, well, Dad, who is my father? My son, it looks like your father was a former king, Uther Pendragon. Well, the people of England began to realize, yeah, we found our long-lost king. So they began to remove him and his family into his father's palace. They began to plan for coronation, and Arthur became the most famous king that England ever had. Now, any person listening to this story today will wonder, now just how much of this can I believe? How much of you believe would depend on your worldview? But I want to remind you, folks, of this. Every ancient society, without any exceptions at all, began their history with stories like the one I just told you, with stories that involve the supernatural. Now you can make of that whatever you will. The Jews were no exception, Christians are no exception, the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Confucians, not so much, but then again their counterparts. The Chinese begin their history again with stories that involve dragons, stories that we call fairy tales. So these kind of stories were to be found at the beginning of every history, and I have a history chart at the house where they'll say, and on that chart, where they give us the nation and then who the kings were, but they'll say period of accurate history begins. In other words, the history I just told you is not considered accurate history. Period of accurate history begins. In the case of England, the period of accurate, Scotland, the period of accurate history begins around 800 CE, 800 CE. For Great Britain, it begins around 550 CE, shortly after Arthur would have died. Arthur was followed by King Constantine, and then shortly after the Germans began moving again, and eventually they replaced the Britons. The Britons moved to, like I say, Brittany and Wales, taking these stories with them. Eventually these stories are written down and left for us to figure out how much more serious history. If we could ever find a coin minted with Arthur's name on it, we don't have. If we could ever find the castle of Camelot, if we could ever find a buried original source or some inscription that would show that Arthur actually existed, we don't have. But Arthur might become something that resembles true history. It's going to be a long time, though, before modern day scholars can accept some of the supernatural elements of the story as being real. Each of you can make up your mind whether or not they ever will. The Goths. All right, moving on, the Goths. By the way, the name Arthur and Merlin is on the test. I mean, I spent a lot of time. The book doesn't mention them. I spent a good bit of classroom time talking about them. Whether you'll see the question or not depends on which test you get. The Goths were divided into two groups, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths. These were the East Goths. And these were the West. These people moved into Italy. These people moved into Spain. I'm writing backwards here. Now, when the Ostrogoths moved into Italy, eventually they became so numerous that they replaced the local population largely. Now, there are some people living in Italy who can claim justifiably they are descended from the Romans, but for the most part, the word Romans ceased to be of use, and there's people called Italians. The Union of Ostrogoth and Latin ceased to be the language, and it was replaced instead by Italian. The Italian language involves a lot of Latin, but Latin continued to be spoken in church services. Latin continued to be the language of the educated. And as recently, folks, 40 or 50 years ago when I was young, doctors would communicate with each other in Latin, or doctors would write out the prescriptions to the word of pharmacy in Latin, because sometimes the prescriptions would contain words that they did not want people to recognize, or did not want people to read. So they would write out a lot of their communication with each other in Latin. Latin was still the language of the educated as recently as when I was still a kid. Today it's more of a dying language. Some churches still conduct their services in Latin, and of course some people want you to know Latin if you're going to major in Roman history, if you're going to major in church history, because so many of the documents for more than 1,000 years, so many church documents were written in Latin. Italy was to become divided and remain divided until 1870. Italy consists of the Kingdom of Venus, the Kingdom of Genoa, the Kingdom of Naples, then the Papal States, or the area around Rome where the popes ruled, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Several, don't worry about the names, but just remember, Italy was to remain divided. The story of the unification of Italy is one you'll run into when you take second semester world history. It was completed. Italy and Germany were both united in 1870. The Roman Empire appeared to these people to still be intact. Again, if you had been alive in the year 5 and 6 and 700, and if you'd been descended Roman, you'd still call yourself Roman. And it makes me wonder sometime if some future historians might try to figure out when the United States fall, and that the United States actually ended in 2010. I mean, you know, I'm not saying that will happen, but here we are, we think we're part of the United States, but they say, no, the United States was so changed by 2010, it was not the same country anymore. But anyway, the Romans, when they finally realized the Roman Empire fell, historians went back and said, now, when did it fall? And they finally assigned an arbitrary date of 476, because that was a date that one of the barbarian chiefs told the boy king to get off the throne, the boy emperor to get off the throne, and sent the diadem and scepter and crown to Constantinople, saying these things are no longer needed in Rome. So, but then again, if you had lived in Rome in 476, you'd notice nothing different at that time than what it had been before. It was just a long, slow, drawn-out process. Anyway, the Visigoths took over Spain. They were very weak and disunited also. They never developed a strong kingdom, and that's where they was just ripe for the Muslim conquest, and the Muslims moved in and partially conquered Spain in the 700s. And there wasn't an exact date, it's just the Muslims came in, and then for the next 800 years, there was a long, long, long fight between the Muslims and the Visigoths. Long fight that lasted 800 years. It eventually ended when King Ferdinand married Queen Isabella, and they two of them got together, and with their combined armies, they drove the last of the Moors out, or the Muslims out of Spain. The year they did this was 1492. When they succeeded in driving out of Spain, and Queen Isabella was able to think about financing Christopher Columbus. And that began the story of American history. But they could not, until they had driven the Moors out of Spain, they simply could not spare 3 ships, even 3 old ones. But it took about 800 years. All right, now the Franks. So from the word Frank, we get to the word French. The word Frank basically means free. They consider themselves the free people. Now, folks, some people say this is one of the things that would eventually make Europe so great. From the very beginning, they tended to limit the power of their government and to set up something that resembled democracy. The Franks were no exception. They had a king, but they limited the power of their king. Anyway, the Franks became ruled by a dynasty called the Merovingian dynasty. Now, folk, here is where we get into what might be a little bit of conspiracy theory. The Merovingian dynasty, all right, I'll tell you. It supposedly comes from the word Mary, the name Mary, not Mary, the mother of Jesus, but Mary Magdalene. Supposedly, one of Jesus' brothers married Mary Magdalene, but some accounts even say that Jesus himself had a son by Mary Magdalene, which I severely discount. But anyway, the Merovingian dynasty claimed that they were descended from King David and his son Solomon and the royal line, and that they were the nearest living relatives of Jesus. They took over, and there have been a lot of Europeans from that time to this who have said that the rightful heirs to the throne of France are the Merovingians. The problem is the last Merovingian we know about died in battle in the 1500s. The Merovingian dynasty was destined to not last very long, but it had a couple of powerful kings. The one your book mentions, I mean, I could mention more, but there was King Clovis. Now this might sound inconsistent because Clovis started out, he was not a Christian. They claimed that they came from the line of David. That claim came later, after Clovis. Clovis was not a Christian at first. But, I mean, when I was in graduate school, we talked in detail, why did he become a Christian? Well, he had several reasons. Number one, his wife was a Christian. His prime minister was a Christian. Half his army were Christians. Most of the generals were Christian. Then his kingdom was fast converting to Christianity. So just like he more or less fell in line, I mean, with his main scholars being Christian, with more than half his court being Christian. He just more or less fell in line and eventually was baptized himself. What makes him unique, though, he was the first European king to be converted to Roman Catholicism. You might say, what about Constantine? Constantine was converted to Arianism, and all the Byzantine emperors after him were Arian Christians, or they were not affiliated with Roman Catholicism. But Clovis was the first one the first Roman Catholic to be converted to Christianity. Clovis went on to conquer, even after he became a Christian, he went on to conquer, and he united much of the French. But his dynasty had a couple of problems, and one of them was, and this is a problem that European monarchs were to have until for the next 1,000 years. Clovis lived around 460 CE. A little bit before Arthur, if Arthur lived at all. These kings would only marry their cousins. You know, they wanted to keep the bloodline. They felt like our bloodline is better than everybody else's bloodline. They didn't know about DNA, they didn't know about genes, so it was all a matter of bloodline. And they said to keep our bloodline pure, we must marry other royalty. Where the result was that Clovis married a very high-born woman who was a cousin of his. And in turn, his sons did the same thing until after a while, the Merovingian dynasty came to consist of a bunch of child kings with feeble bodies and feeble minds. And the Merovingians were not the only ones who had this problem. A typical Merovingian king would be born. His father would die when he was about 6. So he'd be crowned at the age of 6. Because he was weak and sickly, and he wanted to preserve the bloodline, they'd marry him off to a cousin when he was about 14 or 15. He'd have a child when he was about 16, who would become the next king. He'd live to about the age of 21 or 22, then he'd die and leave a 7-year-old boy on the throne. And this was to go on for about 200 or 300 years. Eventually, the people of France got tired of this, and they put the last Merovingian on a shelf, put him in a monastery. And supposedly the Merovingian dynasty has died out. Now, there have been books written about it. One of them called Holy Cross, Holy Grail. And a man named Dan Brown made a movie about it. Any of you happen to have any idea now what I'm talking about? What's that? You've heard a little bit about it, yeah. But anyway, There are persons who will say that World War I was actually a serious attempt to restore a Merovingian on the throne of Europe, and it failed because the side that was in favor of him lost. Be that as it may, there are persons who say that underneath the history we talk about, there's another alternate history that's a little bit different. The other problem that these kings had was they would divide their kingdom up among all their sons. So let's say the king had 3 sons. He died and he would divide his kingdom into 3 sons. Well, if each of those sons had 3 sons, that meant that a kingdom that was once ruled by one king would have to, in 2 generations, be 9 separate kingdoms. Now they eventually learned that, wait a minute now, we have got to give all the estate to one son and no more. And all the crown must go to just one son, usually the oldest. But we cannot keep dividing our kingdoms. And this, of course, this made the kingdom weaker than it otherwise would have been. Anyway, under Clovis, when he died, the kingdom was divided, but the Merovingian kings became weaker and weaker until they eventually were replaced by a line called the Carolingian line, and the Carolingian line did the same thing, similar to what we've read about other dynasties. Say again? Say again. The only one of the Merovingian kings that we probably know about was Clovis. Now Clovis' father was very wealthy, and he made a tomb that had a lot of bees, and eventually somebody found the tomb. These kings would hide away. Somebody found the tomb and found the bees, and Napoleon, when he was crowned, he put a lot of these, there's bees are made out of gold. He put a lot of these gold bees on his uniform to symbolize that he was descended from Clovis' father, Childeric, I believe, or something like that. But anyway, the only name I want you to know from the Merovingian dynasty is Clovis. He's significant because he united the Franks, and he set up a, he was the first Roman Catholic Christian king. And after that, almost every king of Europe, as long as Europe had a king, was Roman Catholic until the Protestant Reformation. Then came the Protestant Reformation, and some of your kings and queens became Lutheran, Anglican, and whatever. All right, German society. The Germans at first were what we might call semi-civilized or even uncivilized. Now, like other ancient peoples, the family, both the immediate family and extended family, made up a lot of your life. I mean, obviously you were likely born into a family, and in your family you had, of course, your father and mother, brothers and sisters, then you had your cousins and your second and third cousins, which made up the clan. Now, if a member of your clan hurt a member of another clan, somebody from that other clan was going to come and get one of you for it. Now, if you study European history, if you ever read Romeo and Juliet, there was a big fight between the Capulets and Montagues that lasted about 200 or 300 years, and by the time it was over with, nobody even knew what started the fight. In my own history, reading about the Cunningham line, there was a big fight between the Cunninghams and Montgomerys. And at one time, Cunninghams got together and killed 5 Montgomerys, and Montgomerys responded by waylaying, lying in wait for a bunch of Cunninghams, and killed about 8 or 10 Cunninghams. The king tried to stop it. In our own country, there was a fight between the Hatfields and McCoys that lasted for generations. Today, the Hatfield descendants, McCoy descendants, get together every year for a party. They reminisce about the fight, but the fighting is long, long over with. But it wound up killing a whole bunch of Hatfields and McCoys both. But there was basically, these families would get in their feuds, and they would last for hundreds of years sometimes. The Romans said, I mean, this is civilization, folks. When a person is hurt, has committed a crime against him, it's up to the state to decide the issue and avenge the wrong, and not up to the family. It took the Germans many generations to develop this concept that, hey, anytime you hurt a person or kill a person or steal from a person, it's a matter for the state to decide, not a matter of, oops, I decided I was hungry, so I robbed you of a loaf of bread, and then some of your family came after me and robbed my family of 5 loaves of bread, or a whole bunch of other stuff. No, it was a matter for the state to decide, but it took a while Now, eventually, under paganism, vengeance is a big part of the pagan religion. And if you look at my comparative religion, you'll see that vengeance. The Greeks, when Helen of Troy was raped, the whole Greek nation went to war against Troy. Again, the feeling that we have to right wrongs, but again, it's supposedly up to the state to do that. Anything else, folk, is uncivilized, is uncivilization, and I'm not going to apologize for saying that. A weregeld, now this is a foreign word. Weregeld. The weregeld was like a fine. In other words, eventually they said, well, instead of, if you steal from me, instead of an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, we'll settle differences with money. A judge would decide how much money the offending party or the offended family is owed. If the offending party has to pay the offended party, we'll decide how much money is owed. So the weregeld was a system of fines. It became a system of revenue for the kings and nobles, where that they could collect fine money, and this still goes on. I mean, if you know anything about city and local governments, even state governments, a lot of their revenue doesn't just come from taxes, but it comes from fines they collect. And my wife, who works for the AJC and deals a lot with government officials, can tell you that some of these cities, they just encourage the cops collect as many speeders as you can, because the fine money will benefit our treasury. So the cops will do everything they can to get you, including hide behind billboards, hide around corners, hide even around abandoned buildings, and all of a sudden, there they are, they jump out and flash your lights from behind you. Yes, it has happened to me. Most persons, if you drive any length of time, the two of my children who have their own cars, both of them have gotten a speeding fine. One of them about $175 and $225. What situation is this? And it can happen to anyone. Get off the expressway where you're doing 70 miles an hour and get onto another road where the speed limit suddenly becomes 55. It's still a 4-lane road, so you still do 70, and they'll get you right there. Or you're still doing 70. I see at least one head nodding. You know a little bit what I'm talking about. But yeah, and I caught myself on the same road doing the same thing. But fortunately, I caught myself and I slowed down. But anyway, weregeld, system of fines. Now, compurgation. Compurgation is where the accused can get a lot of people together to swear that I'm innocent. In other words, if you're accused of a crime, if you can collect enough people together to swear that you were at a certain place, a certain time, and couldn't do it, and swear innocence, then you could get off. But you had to be able to collect reliable witnesses to swear an oath to you that they know that you're innocent. Now, ordeal. This one might seem worth it. Ordeal. This is where the accused was expected to walk on a hot bed of coals, or lie down on a bed of hot coals, or walk on a hot iron. And of course, when you walk on a hot iron barefoot, your feet will blister. But if your feet healed quickly, then you probably were innocent. If your feet did not, I see one of you laughing, but let me tell you something now. A lot of medical doctors will tell you today that guilt will make a person heal more slowly than innocence will. And a lot of persons will tell you that guilt can cause cancer, can shorten your life, can keep you awake at night, can cause insomnia and a whole lot of other problems. So it is a serious issue. But again, they believe that an innocent person would heal more quickly than a guilty person. It sounds kind of primitive to us today. The nearest thing we have today, folks, is the lie detector. I want to elaborate on that a little bit. The lie detector is no longer admissible in court, but then again, they still give us sometimes called polygraph. The idea behind it being that your blood pressure will change when you're lying. When you ask a question you don't want to talk about, your blood pressure is likely to change. Now, this can be defeated Number one, if you stay awake 40 or 50 or 60 hours before the lie detector, your body becomes so numb that it won't change. There's another way, folks, that if you are a chronic habitual liar, to where every time you open your mouth, a lie comes out, you get to where you can do it without even blushing. My dad once said some people can lie without smiling. We got together one time when I was at Lockheed. We were going to tell this woman that she'd been promoted to a certain job. And I was the person who was supposed to tell her as her close friend. The problem was when I started to tell her, I just cracked up. Even though it was like an innocent joke, I couldn't get it out of my mouth without blushing all to pieces. But some people can do it without the blood pressure changing. But I'll tell you, it's a serious issue. I mean, I had another friend of mine at Lockheed who wound up serving a couple years in prison for rape of two minors who were the daughter, this will sound terrible, the daughters of his, the wife he had were married after she had divorced her first husband. He was accused of having sex with them. He took a polygraph and failed the polygraph. It helped convict him. I mean, you can say it shouldn't have, but it helped convict him. He wound up serving a couple years in prison. But it's still a serious matter, and it still can get you in hot water. All right. Leaving that ordeal, hot coals, spade of spikes, whatever, Christianity. The one powerful institution at this time was the church. As civil government failed, as king's power dwindled, the one strong man of the hour was the Pope. I had a student one time ask me, how did the Pope become so powerful? I said, well, to have an office like the Pope, you have to have a political unity. And then that political unity has to have a religious leader. And then all of a sudden the political unity disintegrates, but religious leaders still remain strong. That's basically how the Pope became as powerful as he was, in a nutshell. There were other things that worked in his favor. The church began doing things like performing marriage ceremonies. Before this had been done to the state, and folk to this day, the churches still perform a lot of marriage ceremonies, less perhaps than they once did, but the church began to pattern itself after the Roman government. They began to organize like the government did. The local area was called a parish. The parish was headed up by a priest. You don't have to write this down, but local government, again, this was similar to the way the Roman government had been organized. Then the priest, several parishes together, would be a bishopric, and they would be headed up by a bishop. Over a whole province was an archbishop. Now, as for the Pope, for the first 400 years, he was only Bishop of Rome. And the present Pope, when he got elected a couple years back, he said, I'll never want to forget that I'm also Bishop of Rome. All the popes have been also Bishop of Rome. But they, eventually, there came the office of Archbishop, where several bishoprics were connected to Archbishop, and eventually there came the office of Cardinal. The bishops began to assert their power and began to do more and more things that had been done by the Roman magistrates, and this was especially true as civil government weakened. Again, your marriage was not considered valid unless the church had approved of it, and this was true even of kings. The church began to assert a whole lot of authority, a whole lot of power, and eventually the popes became so powerful that they got to where they could tell the kings what to do. Now, Pope Gregory the Great one thing I want to remember about him was he instituted the calendar that we still use. It's called the Gregorian calendar. Now, Pope, the reason it was necessary, before his time, for the first, about 600 years, by the way, he ruled from about the year 500 or 550, thereabouts, CE. But before his time, we've been using a Julian calendar. But it was found out that under the Julian calendar, the equinoxes and the solstices were not falling on the same day. Now, I had a teacher one time who was asked, why do we have leap year days? And she didn't know, and I'll tell you why. The idea is to keep the solstices and equinoxes falling on the same day. All right, what's a solstice? The summer solstice, where the sun gets as far north as it's going to get before it heads south. Usually it's around June 21st, but it can be June 20th or June 22nd. The fall equinox is where the sun crosses the equator on its way south. These days it's September 22nd. Before 2000 was September 21st, but for the next 100 years we've got September 22nd. The winter solstice, December 21st. That's when the sun gets as far south as it's going to get. And then the spring equinox, which we just experienced, happened this year on March 20th, if I recall correctly, March 20th. That's where the sun crosses the equator on its way north. Now, if we did not have leap year days, we'd lose 4 days every 100 years. That may not sound a lot, but after 500 years, we'd lose 20 days. After 800 years, we'd lose about 40 days, and we'd be singing, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, when outside the temperature would be 95 degrees. That's why we have leap years, to keep the sun in approximately the same position on the same day every year. Gregory realized this, so about 600 the Julian calendar was way off. So he instituted the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar is expected to last 10,000 years before somebody at that time will have to add a day or subtract a day. The Gregorian calendar, by the way, ignores the moon and decided to just keep the moon out of it. We still have the word month, but the months are longer than the lunar month. The Gregorian calendar ignores the moon. The Chinese do not use a Gregorian calendar. The Jews still have their own calendar. The Orthodox still go by their calendar. Now, Pope Gregory organized the Papal States, which I mentioned earlier. The popes were to rule the Papal States from his day for the next 1,100, about 1,100 years until 1870, when temporal power, now the word they used was temporal. Temporal power meant power, secular power. The popes exerted spiritual power and secular power. Eventually, though, their temporal power was taken away from them when the Papal States were dissolved. But the Pope was ruler of the area around Rome for the next 1,100 years. Now, he sent missionaries that converted a lot of Germans to Christianity. He sent monasteries, and these monasteries I'm going to elaborate on in a few minutes, but they were very much a part of European life. Now, Pope Gregory is remembered a lot for helping the poor, and I'm not going to fault him for it because, I mean, I can't say enough. To me, helping the poor is not a job for a king. Pope Gregory was not a king, he was a churchman. It has been said that if all the popes had been like Pope Gregory, all of Christian Europe today would still be Catholic. There would not have been a Protestant Reformation. But unfortunately, not all the popes were like him. My brother-in-law has a book about the popes, and there's only two of them. They want to call the Great. Pope Gregory the Great, and then one of them in my own lifetime, Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd only lasted about 4.5 years, but he did a lot to reform and change the church, and some people want to call him the Great. But Pope Gregory actually has the official title of Pope Gregory the Great. And if any of them deserves it, perhaps he does. Monasteries. The monasteries served as the school, the college, the hospital, such as they existed, the library, the meeting halls, the learning center. They served as a civic center. They were the cultural and intellectual center of Europe. They did a lot to not only preserve the Bible, but they preserved the works of Cicero, the works of Virgil, the works of Homer, Herodotus, Aristotle. They did a lot to preserve ancient knowledge. A lot of your monks spent a lot of their time copying ancient manuscripts and preserving them for later generations. The member of the monastery, the male members of the monastery were the monks. The monks were headed up by an abbot. The female members were the nuns. They lived in a convent. I'm not going to write this next one down, but the nuns were headed up by Mother Superior. They took the vow of three things, and folk I'll argue this because I thought I knew it. It seemed obvious, but I'm filling a blank test, and I have never done well on filling a blank test. I missed it. They took a vow of three things, and those three things were poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty, they would never own anything. All their property was turned over to the church. Chastity, they promised to never engage in any kind of sex, or they lived a life of celibacy. At least that was what they promised to do. A life of celibacy means a life with no sex, no marriage. Obedience, they would always obey their superiors, their Mother Superior or their abbot, whichever the case may be. At first, they lived as solitary hermits. Then they began to live in communities. And then they began to build a structure, a building, their monastery, where they were sheltered somewhat. They did a lot of farm work. They did a lot to help the poor. They did a lot of missionary work and a whole lot of copying of ancient manuscripts. And they even served as teachers. Martin Luther, for instance, later was become a monk, and he became a doctor of at the university where he taught at. They served as teachers. They basically, they cared for the sick. They were hospitals, libraries, community centers, all rolled into one. Without them, European history might have been much different than what it was. All right. Moving on, we're skipping several generations of history now. We come to eventually where the Merovingian dynasty was replaced by the Carolingian dynasty. The first Carolingian of any importance was Charles Martel. Hopefully you remember him. He was the one who defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours in 714, I believe. 714, I think that was the year. Maybe it was 712, somewhere around there. He met the Moors and stopped them, and stopped their advance to Europe. They conquered a lot of Spain, and they were about ready to conquer France, but they were stopped. And of course, the Muslims started fighting among themselves, and they were not able to advance to mount an effective campaign against France, even though they did get a lot of Sicily for a time. They eventually conquered a lot of Greece and the East. They got much of the Mediterranean world, but they were driven out of a lot of it. But Charles Martel was a Carolingian. He was only the prime minister, or mayor. They called him big man of the palace, the mayor of the palace. He was not king. The Merovingian was still king, but even though the Merovingians were just child kings, totally ineffective. Charles Martel had a son named Pepin. Pepin decided, hey, we mayors of the palace should not have to pretend that we're not kings. So he appealed to the Pope, and the Pope said, "You're right, become a king." So he was a small man. He's known as Pepin the Short. His followers lifted him up on their shields and raised him up on a shield, and he became king. And the last Merovingian was put on a shield. So Pepin was the first of the Merovingians, of the Carolingians, who was crowned king. Pepin died, and he had a son named Charlemagne. The word Charlemagne means Charles the Great. Charles the Great, Charlemagne was the greatest ruler of that time during about a 700 or 800 year period. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. He was a warrior. He undertook 54 military campaigns. And if you read a detailed account of him, it said in this year of his reign, he warred against the Saxons. Then the next year of his reign, he warred again against the Saxons. Then most of his campaigns were against the Saxons. He was successful in most of them. Curiously, in the year 790, there was no war. Charlemagne was really busy at the time and just never bothered But the Saxons fought him fiercely. Now, Charlemagne had a very inefficient government system that only worked while he was alive. He operated his government from horseback. And he would ride around from place to place, but he would surround himself with his counts. And he'd finally say to one count, you go take over Champagne and become the county of Champagne, and you take over the county of Brittany. And he would assign the counts to their jobs. Now, he had a palace, but he seldom went to it. But mostly he operated from his horseback and went around from place to place, leading campaigns. And he realized after a time that, hey, my nobles just simply do not understand my orders. I need to teach them to write. So he got together and told this nobles, send your sons to my palace, and I will instruct them in writing. He himself, now believe it or not, he was emperor. He could neither read nor write. And neither could the nobility. But he said, that way I will write my orders down, even though he couldn't write, but he'd have a scribe. And that way, when the orders get to him, he realized that by the time he uttered an order verbally, and this order passed from one person to the next, by the time it got to the person it was intended for, it would be altogether different. So he'd say, write it down on a sheet of paper and say, now give this to the Count of Champagne over here, and give this to the Count of Languedoc. He realized the value of education. But anyway, what's important about this is believed to be the beginning of public schools in Europe that eventually was to lead to most of Europeans becoming educated. At first, the schools were only for the sons of the nobles, so they would know how to follow the king's orders. Eventually, the king himself was educated. Charles educated his son, by the way. The nobility began educating their sons. His government officials also had to travel long distances on horseback. Now, he's remembered also, in the year 800, he got word that the Pope was in trouble, and he said, well, I'm going to help the Pope out. After all, there was a Pope that had gotten his father to be accepted as king. So he went to Italy. And while in Italy, the Pope surprised him in a ceremony on Christmas Day by asking him to kneel. And when Charlemagne kneeled in front of the Pope put a crown on his head and crowned him Roman Emperor. It was the first time a Frankish king had been crowned Roman Emperor. This was the beginning of the title of Holy Roman Empire, which was to last for 1,000 years. In 1802, 1,002 years later, Napoleon abolished the title. But the Holy Roman Empire they were to pretend that they were what was left of the Roman Empire. There was attempts. There was an attempt by the church to revive the Roman Empire, even though Charlemagne was definitely not a Roman, whatever else he might have been, he was not Roman. But there was an admission that the Romans were no longer powerful enough to have their own empire. So Charlemagne became a Roman Empire. We don't know if he was pleased with it or not. We aren't told, but other persons had set a precedent, and later popes began crowning one emperor after another, and again, this was to last for 1,000 years. Charlemagne has said that in an time period when most men were reckless in their eating and drinking, he was moderate in both. Now, I want to say this about drinking. I had a student do a paper on it. Europeans drank, almost every one of them, drank constantly because European water quickly became very polluted, and it still is. Yeah, I see one head nodding. I've heard it still. So a lot of Europeans still drink wine. The idea is to try to be able to control it. Now, some of this drinking, though, had to be curtailed during the Industrial Revolution. And this was especially true in industrial countries like France became in Britain, the United States, when employers had to hire men who didn't drink, were sober, and they could only afford to have sober men operate the machinery. The drinking is known to have gotten a lot of persons to take a lot of risks that a sober person would not take, and a lot of them died younger than they would have because of accidents they had, not just like they didn't have automobiles. They would work on construction and get on a ladder that if they had been sober they would never have climbed on, or get on a scaffold that they would never, that was not stable enough for them, and fall off. So drinking did a lot to kill a lot of them. And again, when the Industrial Revolution came, the industrial tycoons, people going to the industries, said to the churches, do all you can to get the members to drink, and when a person stops drinking, send them to me and we'll hire them. And to this day, if you go to a factory and the factory manager thinks that you're drunk, he'll send you home. Now, not always. We had a man at Lockheed whose job was building wire harnesses. He did not operate any machinery except a clamp to put lugs on the end of a wire. He was known to be a chronic drunk, but they let him come in, sit down, do his work, and then go home. He did not do his own driving. He had been caught too many times and lost his license, but he would come in, work his shift, and go home. But he did not, he was not allowed to operate any of the machinery. Again, these places have got to make sure that persons operating the machinery are sober, because these machines can hurt a person. But anyway, Charlemagne was not so much into heavy drinking as other people were. All right, folks, with that, I want to close. We have 4 more classes and then the final. Hopefully all of you are excited about it. Those, again, I'm not going to be too particular about the papers. I mean, don't worry about what Turnitin says. The syllabus says June night, but I will probably wind up not looking at it until late tomorrow evening. Get them in. Get them in. All right. Have a good weekend.
So this is going to be on the final?
What I said about Charlemagne, yeah, that's some of that.
So how many more chapters include?
Oh, 12 and 13 is all we need. And I'm going to spend the next 4 periods talking about chapters 12 and 13.
So that's,
I'm going into a lot more detail because it's European history, and I'm going into a lot more detail than I did in all the other chapters.
12, 13, and
12 and 13, and then half of it's comprehensive.
But that's still.
Half of it's 12 and 13, half of it's comprehensive.
So we just got it.
Yeah, so study hard on 12 and 13, and hopefully what you learn from chapters 1 through 11 will come back to you
Oh.
on a multiple choice test.
So
Likely,
I said,
will.
stop it.
Yeah. What's that? Turn the paper in as soon as you can. I mean, just